welcome to the Free Speech Union podcast. My name is Nick Han, and for those of you who are listening or watching this, we're really pleased to have Professor Eric Heinze with us. He is speaking to us from the United States, although he's normally based in London, in England. And he is the Professor of Law and Humanities at the School of Law, Queen Mary, University of London. He has worked in some crucial areas: legal philosophy, justice theory, jurisprudence, human rights, most notably, from our point of view, in the area of free speech. And his latest book is called Coming Clean, and the subtitle is The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. Eric, rather than me trying to summarize your book, we want to hear it in your own words. What was the, well, first of all, thank you for joining us. And what was the principal motivation in writing this book? Because it's a very timely book, in my view. Can you tell us what the motivation was?
Yeah. I can sum up the motivation in one very all too well-known phrase: culture wars. Right, as you already suggested, a lot of thought which we might broadly associate with progressives or with the left, or at least which have been dominant, let's say, among many progressive or leftist thinkers, have caused violent backlashes, right? Even many progressive ideas that are very useful, that are important, that I generally praise in the book, right, such as opposition to racial discrimination, to patriarchy, to heteronormativity, to economic exploitation, right, right, to to a whole oppressive histories of colonialism, right. What we find are backlashes, so that people on a kind of very entrenched or far right simply want to stop doing any inquiry of that type at all, right? And indeed want to, just dismantle things like DEI, dismantle queer theory, dismantle Me Too, right? And what I'm trying to suggest in the book is that there are some important criticisms to be made that by no means have to be made from that arch reactionary standpoint, which is not particularly informative, not particularly helpful, not particularly right. Well,
Mm.
it's very right, but not particularly correct, in my opinion.
So there is an element here of asking, particularly those on the left, to apply this critical lens, the critical theory approach, if we can call it a single theory or a single approach, but this kind of post-Marxist or post-Marx approach to analyzing political, social, cultural issues. And can we get those people to actually apply that approach to themselves as well and to their own, modern history or recent history? Is that a fair summary?
Yes, but with two very important qualifications. First, again, I mean, I think as we've already hinted, um, you can't generalize about the left or about progressives or even about radicals or about critical theory, which is a focus of my
Yeah.
book. Again, I think you and I agree that these are very broad concepts, sometimes a bit improvised. They cover enormous, a vast array of problems, of perspectives, of pasts. And so the point of the book is not to give any definition to leftism or to the words like progressive or radical or anything, or indeed critical theory, right? I don't try to subsume them all under one overarching model. That would just be a silly reductionism, and it's not necessary to what I want to say. All I want to do is look again at some trends that I think have been very, very influential, and that have also caused some real problems on the left. And I want to take a deeper look at them while avoiding these very simplistic right-wing criticisms, which in a sense are not even criticisms. They're just kind of trashing and tearing down. They're just frontal attacks, often by people who scarcely, have read any of this, let
Yeah.
alone to seriously engage with it. So that's one qualification is, yes, I'm talking about the left, but again, acknowledging that that can mean many things and trying to focus on certain important trends. And second, as to this idea of turning it all, that leftists need to turn it all on themselves, you see, one problem here is that many leftists are surprised and indeed outraged when I say this, because their belief is that this is something they've always done, right? They believe that the left or progressive thought or indeed critical theory, right, has always, stopped, taken stock, asked where did we go wrong, how can we improve, right? And in certain ways, I guess they have done this pretty much like people across the political spectrum sooner or later, say, oh, where have we, how can we appeal? How can we broaden our appeal, or what mistakes have we made, right? That's nothing so unusual, is just to, consider mistakes, with a view toward presenting something more palatable or more appealing. But I'm just saying it goes far deeper than this, the problems on the left. And I tried to diagnose this problem by looking at, despite the differences, one very important theme in critical theory over decades. And indeed, right, you mentioned Marx, this could be traced right back to Marx, but I guess I'm most interested in, manifestations over the past few decades, which, most directly shape our own conversations. And I think even if, for example, certain politicians or policymakers on the left, maybe on the campaign trail, even if they're not necessarily standing up to do a history lesson, their fundamental concepts of justice, and indeed of mass or systemic or structural injustice, is thinkable only on the basis of a certain very concerted understanding of history. And so much of the message of progressives and leftists, particularly in past decades, although I would trace it back further, has been essentially to teach us that history is not simply about the great deeds of great men, right? Or the high deeds of great men, right? You might say the glorifying histories, indeed the self-justifying histories of Western civilization. No, what critical theorists, what progressives have been teaching for a long time now, right, is that history, the practice of history, the teaching and communication and discussion of history must fundamentally be a collective exercise in self-scrutiny, an exercise in collective self-examination. And that's good. In fact, I think this is absolutely crucial to democracy. What would be the purpose of democracy if it were not fundamentally to look at past, at weighty problems that didn't just fall from heaven, that have a certain history, that we have to look at critically. So in many ways, I think critical theory is essential to democracy. Yeah. And that's why I'm very far from those conservatives who rather dumbly, right, from a point of view of I think considerable ignorance about what critical theory is, simply dismiss it, simply attack it, right? I would call critical theory absolutely essential to the practice of democracy. But then what has gone wrong?
Yeah.
And so what I try to present, I present this notion of history as self-scrutiny, as collective self-scrutiny, in two steps, right? I refer to this process as memory politics. Memory is step one, politics is step two. The memory part will not come as any big surprise, right? It means, right, memory simply means trying, however difficult it may sometimes be, however controversial it may sometimes be, trying to compile and to agree on some working historical record. Now, we know that even at that step one, right, history of colonialism, history of capitalism, history of militarism, history of imperialism, right? History of patriarchy, history of heteronormativity, right? We know that even trying to compile the history, compile the record, there are going to be real debates, even as to the most basic concepts that we're using, right? Like class, right? Like power, right? Oppression, and so forth. Nevertheless, this, despite those problems, critical theorists do base a lot of their teaching on some assumed corpus, some corpus which they see as sufficiently settled to be reliable and to build on. That brings us to step 2, which is the politics. Now, this is crucial because my book, I talk on every page about history, but it's not a history book. It's a book about step 2. It's about what are we then doing with history? And we all know that particularly when we're dealing with these hot histories, these controversial histories, these histories which feed into present controversies that are constantly polarizing us, right? We know that it's going to be almost impossible to separate teaching of history from a certain political project or political aims or indeed political agenda. I don't really expect that of anybody, to be honest, right? I just accept the fact that discussions of controversial histories relating to controversial presents, they're always going to be inflected by people's political objectives. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And again, in some ways, it's the reason we're doing the history, is to get a grip on the present. We disagree about the present, so of course we're going to have disagreements about the past. That's good. More power to it, right? Let those thousand blossoms bloom. But what then comes next in step 2 is this idea, again, crucial to critical theory, crucial to progressive thought, that history should not just be the affair of academics. It should not just be confined to the textbooks and the lecture halls and the seminar rooms, right? Step 2 of memory politics is that these histories, which might germinate in the laboratories of the universities and academics, right, then have to be disseminated to the widest possible public. Now, this is indeed a revolutionary way of doing history, and I applaud it, right? Again, throughout many cultures still today, and much of history, as far as I can tell, teaching history was much about teaching legend, right? Again, teaching the high deeds of the great men, the great battles that were won, the great conquests, right? Starts with Alexander the Great, skips over to Julius Caesar, Charlemagne. Before you know it, we're up to, Winston Churchill or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson and Winston Churchill, right? Again, we all know this, right? And indeed, I think for many critical theorists, the point is not so much to just stop talking about any of that. I mean, some might say that. I think serious critical theorists don't think we need to go that far. Yes, these are histories too, the battlefield histories, the histories of, of centers of power. Of course, you can't just ignore that. But critical theorists, progressive thinkers, indeed, we often hear the phrase that we need now to tell the untold stories, right? What were also the contributions of women, of LGBTQ people, of colonized people, of ethnic minorities, right? And again, this is completely right, right? Again, very much unlike the arch conservatives today. I entirely applaud this. Again, this is what critical thinking is, and it's necessary to democracy. And indeed, maybe it's no surprise that many of those far-right conservatives are perfectly happy to dismantle democracy altogether. I'm seeing it right now around me every minute on my little visit to the United States, and not only here. There's plenty of it in Europe, right? And so, of memory politics, and indeed goes back to Karl Marx, right? His famous Feuerbach thesis, number 11. Philosophers have only ever tried to interpret the world. However, the point is to change it. That has always been part, even among progressives who haven't read a word of Marx, this has always been part. It's not just an academic exercise. It's an exercise in public engagement. We need to spread these histories, these untold stories, through film, through documentary, through television, through museum exhibitions, through training programs, through special events. And
Can
this
I
is
can
where
I ask can I ask a question at this point? So, if we have a lot of academics who have, in recent decades, particularly, begun to popularize a lot of this critical theory approach in their different domains, whether it's indigenous, critical theory, if it's based on gender, race, and whatever the area may be. But if they have knowingly or unknowingly drawn from the kind of theoretical basis of Marxism or variants of Marxism, earlier Marxism, then is there not that problem that there is inherent in that basis a kind of an antagonism, whether it's a class antagonism or a racial antagonism or a gender antagonism, depending on your particular niche, specialty or area, and how does that translate if the entire basis of that theory has come from this antagonistic worldview? Um, does that not make it more difficult to sort of apply this in a democratic setting? Because in democracy, we do have winners and losers in one sense, but we don't, it's not a zero-sum game, or at least it shouldn't become one. And so there's this element of tolerance, this element of allowing for diversity of thought and opinion. Um, and I'm not seeing that. I've come from personally, I've come from more of a social democratic tradition, and that still, in many respects, shapes how I look at and respond to politics. But I am certainly feeling very isolated when I look at many other people on the left, or people at least who would consider themselves leftists, those who've come from a very radical position. And I feel like there is not the space, the bandwidth for people with more moderate democratic, you know, perhaps closer to the center viewpoints. And that type of, I'm not going to call it necessarily overt censorship, but there's a certain element of intimidation that people who are more moderate, who are more democratic in nature on the left, find it difficult to actually get a word in.
I have 3 points to make on that one. Okay.
Sure.
Two of them more preliminary, and then I'll get to the real point, which is the real point of my book. Um, of course, people deeply committed to critical theory, progressive thought, um, they will not say that they're doing antagonism. They will say they're doing inclusion.
Sure.
And so then you get into difficult questions about, well, what does inclusion mean? And many of them will say, again, many of them will say that we need to look at these centuries old histories of Western civilization, and particularly of Western liberal democracy, precisely to understand how it has always claimed to include, it has always claimed to break down the antagonisms, while in fact systemically using its own values to keep them in place. Indeed, this brings us to my second point, which this was Marx's insight, right? Or one of his many insights, right? That, right, he called this the superstructure, right, of liberalism, right? That, right, that liberalism would develop these justifying discourses of capitalism, right, which would be discourses of individual freedom, civic equality, economic opportunity, seemingly universal, seemingly applicable to all, right? And that these very discourses, these very values and norms would be used by the powerful, by the courts, by others in power to justify existing conditions which were precisely the opposite, right? Which were conditions of class division above all, right? Of course, let's remember that Marx does write about and is very conscious of things like European colonialism, imperialism, militarism, racism, slavery, right? Patriarchy, right? He absolutely mentions these problems. For him, they're all really derivative of class difference, right? Again, this became one of the colossal points of division on the left, and I think it's probably still going on. It kind of ebbs and flows, and it's not an easy one. And so this gets us really, I think, to the point that I'm trying to make in the book. again, as I said, I mean, even, jumping off from this last point. So again, these are polar oppositions within progressive thought. Is it really all ultimately just about economics, right? Yeah, right. Are all these antagonisms of race, of gender, of class, and so forth really ultimately just about economic conditions? Or do we have to understand them in other ways? For patriarchy, racism, do we, yes, look at some economic oppression, but also try to understand other ways in which these have been very entrenched problems, right? And so, again, I think this debate might go on forever, or these debates
Mm.
might go on forever. One of the things I'm trying to say in the book is, yeah, let them go on, right? Again, I don't commit myself to any one school of critical theory. And again, I acknowledge that there are many, even sometimes in contradiction or opposition to each other. And so getting back to this idea of step 2 of memory politics, this crucial step, right? Marx's famous thesis, this crucial step of don't keep it in the classroom, in the textbooks, bring it out to the broadest possible
Yeah.
public, again, through film and culture and, any means possible, but training and so forth, right? Now, one of the things I argue is that the left has never really taken this step 2 with itself. So that's what I mean, right? So my point is not that the left doesn't, again, that leftists don't every now and then sit down and think, oh, where might we have gone wrong and what might we have done better? Again, this you find in many movements, probably all of
Mm.
them, if they have any kind of durability, you kind of have to do that because conditions change. You need to expand your appeal and so forth, and deal with new problems and past shortcomings and so forth. So yeah, that goes on the left the same way it goes on anywhere. The problem goes deeper. What this leftist critique of history has been focused on the idea that mass injustice in the West has been structural and systemic, and therefore part and parcel of the very fabric of liberal democracy, or liberal democracy and capitalist economics, right, depending on how you want to view it. And therefore, we have to study this history because our ongoing problems are outgrowths of the structural and systemic nature of prior mass injustices, right? Right? And so we have to, so to speak, come clean about that past if we are going to honestly, sincerely, candidly deal with present injustices. Now, the point
It,
of the book is to say that the left says that it does this with its own pasts, but it doesn't.
yeah.
What happens instead, right? And, I cite many examples in the book, is that, leftists will do step number 1. They do take step almost always now. They will take step number 1. They will say, yes, Stalinism was atrocious. The Mao's Cultural Revolution was atrocious. The evolution of the Kim dynasty in North Korea, atrocious, right? That's not what we ever wanted. That's not what we ever supported, right? We wash our hands of that, right? That has nothing to do with what we support now. That was never the real socialism,
Mm.
right? That's bad faith. You cannot say that our histories of Western liberal democracy must fundamentally be critiques of systemic and ongoing injustice as the necessary way of understanding present injustice, while at the same time saying, right, that these histories of leftist commitments, right, that are only in the past. They're done and dusted, right? That was never what we were really doing, right? We can wash our hands of it, right? Right? We have to either look at both sets of histories as involving structural and systemic injustice that has to be confronted to understand the world today, or neither. Of course, I wouldn't favor the latter because the latter would kind of get rid of history altogether. So I favor the former, that yes, let's continue doing these critical histories of the West. Let leftist progressives continue teaching us how to do that, but only on condition that they now take the same step 2, which they have been adopting for the rest of us for decades, for too long,
Mm.
through most of their history, with very few exceptions, right? And then I
So
try to give some examples in the book.
yeah, so in terms of the motivation to try and a lot of people on the left will object to these words, but to suppress the more traditional conservative narratives around history and around the explanations of current political realities. That that whether people on the left want to admit to that or not, there is that type of suppression that we see here in New Zealand, and at the same time, I wonder whether this necessary uh, self-examination that you explore in the book is incentivized in any way for those more radical activists on the left who are at times pushing their ideological agenda into the more popular kind of arena, particularly through media. A lot of journalists, a lot of people in media have been heavily influenced by professors, by lecturers at university. When they were there and attending university, and they've kind of taken that into their work in popular culture, through media, through entertainment, and other areas, and teaching especially. Um, what incentive is there though for those more radical proponents of uh, the approaches you've talked about to do this? Because a lot of people, I think, on the right would say, well, we've got to just fight back, and we've got to, cancel, or negate this influence by, for instance, in Florida, banning critical race theory from being taught in schools. As one example. How do we get past that desire to censor the other side because people think winner takes all and that's the only way forward? Especially I think given the way that a lot of critical theory has advanced this idea that it's our turn to shine. We were suppressed, whichever identity group we're talking about, we were suppressed for centuries. We were marginalized, and the dominant group had their time. Now it's our time, and what's sort of implicit in that, and sometimes actually explicitly proposed, is that we will now step forward and we will assume a much greater share of power or influence. And we're seeing that in New Zealand at the moment in terms particularly of racial division and political representation. Sorry,
And
that's a long, quick question.
well, yeah, well, you raise, a number of points, which we could spend a long time on, because you name a number of important and very difficult points. Um, and I think what's important to keep in mind here, right? Again, one of the salient features of critical theory is to connect dots, right? Again, Marx would be an extreme example, and I don't want to say that all leftists do it the way he did it, right? So his extreme example, racism, colonialism, patriarchy. Well, he didn't know about heteronormativity. I don't know really what he thought about that, but you get the idea. Now, there's all the forms of oppression which were acknowledged as such by progressives at his time, right? And they all deeply relate to each other. They're all part of the same structure, right? And so we need to dig deeper into that structure. So Marx was the ultimate dot connector. Now, today, critical theorists don't necessarily do it in that what some would call reductionist way, again, depending on your view of Marx, and yet do deeply connect dots. So even if they don't want to reduce it all to economics, yet many will, like if you're a critical race theorist, or if you're a feminist, right, or indeed if you're a queer theorist, right, or a post-colonial theorist, you will tie this into economics, you will tie it sometimes into racism, you will tie it into assumptions of gender, so that all of these different forms of oppression have to be understood as interrelated, interconnected, intersectional.
Yeah.
And one of the things I say is in the book is that when it comes time for the leftists to self-reflect, all of a sudden they don't find any dots to connect. Right. And so, right. So if you say to certain activist group, what about Marx? Oh, yeah, but that has nothing to do with us. Right. None of us support Marx. Right. Right. Well, we don't even read my, that's not what we talk about at all. Right. All of a sudden there are no dots connect. Now, again, if you want to call yourself a progressive group today, understanding progressive, in some recognizable way as liberationist or egalitarian or socialist, or however you're construing it, these ideas don't fall from heaven, right? There are long histories to leftist commitments to liberationism, to egalitarianism, just as there are long histories of liberalism, wedded to notions of individual equality, economic opportunity, and so forth, right? So each side has a long history of ideological commitments, and each side has to take responsibility for them, right? So, and one of the things I show in the book is that, again, when criticizing, certain, and rightly so, mass injustices of Western civilization, again, a million dots are being connected.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you're right. And I show this with the Ukraine war, with the question of anti-Semitism, all of no dots to connect, right? This has nothing to do with that. Right. And so it's just not possible that histories of mass or if it is, I want to know the methodology that gets you there. But I think it's not possible that histories of mass injustice on the West are structural, systemic, ongoing, and therefore necessary to any understanding of Western liberal democracy. Whereas on the left, oh, well, we're done with Stalin. Oh, well, we're done with Mao, right? We never had anything to do with that. That wasn't the real socialism. This is what I call the purity narrative, right? Seeing one's rivals as having produced, generated mass injustice systemically, structurally, in a way integral to what they stand for, right? Whereas, again, always willing to take step one, right? Acknowledging, oh, yes, on our side too, there were injustices, but then always positioning them as just accidents, just mistakes, not the real or the pure.
Yeah, I think you do that
People
in
don't
your book.
usually think pure, but it really
Yeah,
is about purity.
I think you do that in your book. I think with that example of Owen Jones, the left-wing journalist. I think he writes for the Guardian and other publications. In his examination, if we can call it that, of the former Labour Party leader in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, and the anti-Semitism scandal that was that was going on in the party, particularly under Corbyn's leadership, and I found it an interesting example in that Owen Jones doesn't uh, really wrestle with the problem. He simply kind of catalogs a series of steps taken or not taken by Corbyn, and kind of puts it down to sort of accident or whatever it was. Never really, there's never really a mea culpa. There's never an admission that there is a problem of any kind here. It's just somehow all accidental when things go wrong. Um, and you mentioned before too, this idea that there is a fracturing often amongst the progressive left or the woke left, whatever you want to call them, whereby people say, well, we're not with that group. But at the same time, then there are these loose alliances, at times very inexplicable kind of alliances. I guess an example would be, Quest for Palestine. This often cited example of these very strange bedfellows who, I guess, given the time and place, if they were in the same location, would not coexist happily. And I think that's the difficulty is how do we make sense of this? Is it purely an alliance of convenience? I mean, you've talked about there being sort of these antecedents, these ideological commonalities that they have. But if there is no alliance now on the left, and if people on the left, for instance, the Guardian newspaper, if people in the Guardian newspaper don't want to counter, the arguments of each other, and actually call out some of these problems, whether it's an Owen Jones or anyone else writing, if some of their fellow journalists on the left don't want to challenge this thinking, then what hope do we have of this kind of internal reform occurring?
Yeah, Guardian is an interesting example here because, again, the Guardian will do histories of Stalinism, of Maoism,
Yeah.
And even also trying to link these to politics today in places in places like Russia, China, and elsewhere, And again, so they'll happily take step, even proudly flaunt step one. Yes, indeed, which I call overcoming factual denialism. There's rarely factual denialism. There will be an acknowledgement of the facts of mass atrocities, right? I won't say on the left, but rather I'll say by regimes to which the left, at the very least, lent great legitimacy,
Sure.
but often even zealous support, right? Depending, again, on which left you're talking about. But then again, where is that then the starting point for the rest of what is said? And here now, Owen Jones, I think, becomes a very, very interesting example, you might say, of both the best and the worst of what I'm trying to pinpoint, right? And so, under the 5 years of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, right? I mean, there were certain incidents of anti-Semitism because at around the time, or just before he acceded to the leadership, there had been a hefty flare-up in Israel, Gaza. And so Jeremy Corbyn stepped into an atmosphere, right, in which leftists were very much engaged in this problem. And first of all, I choose Owen Jones for several reasons. First of all, among British journalists, he's among the most fervent critics of Israel, and really almost kind of hour by hour, if you read his Twitter feeds, right? Now, with this, all the horrendous events of the Gaza war, literally, or even minute by minute, he's very much in, how this is, fundamentally, Israel is the power, Israel is committing the atrocities, right? And so, one reason I pick Owen Jones is so that very few people could then accuse me of a pro-Israel bias if he's the only source I use. Another reason, another reason, I think a more important reason, right? Right. So again, if I had used things like, I don't know, the Anti-Defamation League or B'nai B'rith or something, right? People would say, oh, what kind of source is that? They're completely biased. So instead, I took someone, who is generally seen as rather leftist, to say the least, right? And who openly supported Corbyn, even while trying to be constructively critical. Was fundamentally committed and openly so, even openly saying I'm wearing two hats, both as trying to be an objective journalist, but also, I'm openly supporting, Corbyn and, that particular politics, right? But then he's interesting for even more reasons, right? Before I even get to what Owen Jones actually says and does, why this choice? But for the most important reason is that when these incidents of anti-Semitism were starting to occur kind of, one after another, sometimes a torrent of them, but even in considerable succession among very prominent people in the Labour Party. Again, many were just going into denial, right? Oh, we're no more anti-Semitic than anybody else. If you look at some such and such statistics, which in fact, did not necessarily bear out the claim, but never mind. There was again, this is all just Israeli propaganda. This is just trying to, just trying to attack Corbyn, trying to, discredit him and so forth, right? So one was that, it's all a plot, which is, of course, an interesting way of denying anti-Semitism, is to say it's all a plot. All right, never mind.
By whom? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, but never mind.
Yeah.
But Owen Jones did not do this. And I do praise him for this. Right? Owen Jones said, yes, there's a problem here, right? Now, he did this he did this in a few places, but in two very prominent places. First, he did it in a Guardian article, a kind of op-ed, right? Where he said, we have to be, and this was just around the time, I can't remember the exact days, but just around the time Corbyn had taken the leadership. So this was more Jones's effort to kind of head off this problem. Let's nip it in the bud. And so there his approach is very much, he says, let's be careful of it. So he doesn't deny it as others have been doing. But then all of his examples of anti-Semitism are from the far right, going back to Nazism, right? So in that article, he says almost nothing about leftist anti-Semitism. 5 years later, he writes a book. Corbyn has just stepped down as Labour leader, and the anti-Semitism, was continuing apace. And now in that, and this is now a book, it's not just a brief op-ed. Now Jones writes an entire book on where did Labour go wrong under Corbyn, where did Corbyn go wrong, and his circle and his supporters. There he devotes a whole chapter to anti-Semitism. And there he does start documenting, okay, this happened, this happened, this happened, right? And these are just facts about, various, members of the Labour Party, sometimes rank and file, but sometimes very prominent ones, I dare say influential ones, saying pretty outrageous things. And again, Jones, unlike so many others, says, yes, this is anti-Semitism. We have to deal with it as such. And so that's a plus. So that I want to credit him for, and I do credit him for that, because at least he was far ahead, not only of many people in the Labour Party, and many people supporting Corbyn, but far ahead actually of many in the Academy. Actually, Jones was even, I think, far ahead of them, although from the Academy we would have expected better. So in many ways, Jones was way ahead of all these people, particularly at the time he's writing these things. But, and I think you've already guessed it from your last remark, here again, what's also interesting about Jones, another reason for the choice, is when Jones, as we would expect, is talking about racism, about poverty, about LGBTQ, about colonialism, I noticed several examples where he literally uses the words systemic or structural or ongoing, right? But particularly systemic and structural, or even if he's not using those precise words, he's analyzing it as such. And that's the important thing, right? So he's putting there, right, this has been entrenched. Then he does this whole chapter on anti-Semitism under Corbyn, right? And as you say, he never uses the words, but more importantly, he never uses the concepts. He never analyzes anti-Semitism under Corbyn as structural or systemic on the left. And so each time he goes through each event, it's just a banana peel. It's just a kind of slapstick, a tragic slapstick. Oops, Corbyn, he should have done this. He should have responded sooner, right? Such and such advisor shouldn't have said that, right? It's all just little mistakes, right? And in theory, we're not anti-Semitic at all, right? This is all just a big blunder. And so again, I ask, how can it be that all of these other forms, right, which have long histories, are systemic and structural, while leftist anti-Semitism, which did not start in 2015, right? Which also, these patterns which Owen Jones documents had precedents going way, way back, they're only ever accidents. And then I finish up that analysis by saying that this is not just a journalist, right? Who we might expect to be dwelling a bit more at the surface. If you look at some of the most influential philosophers, critical theorists, they do the exact same thing. And so one reason, again, just like with Chomsky, one reason, that I look at Jones is I don't want to attack him, I don't want to attack any one individual, but I focus on certain people when I think that what they're doing is really illustrating something far deeper and broader.
Mm. Look, I'm conscious of your time, and I guess I have one sort of final question, and this has to do with, means and ends. And there is a really clear erosion or shift in this country, and I think much of the West, towards an ends focus rather than how we conduct ourselves in reaching those ends. And so the means versus the ends, and or the old dilemma really of what's justifiable in achieving the goals of a political group or class. And we see this problem, especially here in New Zealand, not only on the left, but also emerging on the right. There is a willingness to dispense with democratic norms. There's a willingness to dispense with, and I know this goes back to some of your earlier sort of thoughts, but if we do dispense with basic concepts like free speech, as a political norm, if we dispense with, sort of equal representation in our political system, in terms of one person, one vote, and the weighting given to that vote, then then I mean we recognize that we're in for big trouble. How do we get how do we get past this problem? How do we find some solution that appeals not only to the right but also to the left?
And I don't, and this will come as no surprise to you. I don't think there will be any one solution, any simple formula. These problems are complex. We're dealing with people coming at them from very different angles. Again, both on conservative, leftist, and also in the middle. From all of these people are coming at them, from very different perspectives with different assumptions and expectations and values. And so I only want to kind of offer one way in and not the way in. And so lately I've been telling it through a very simple tale, which I call the tale of two lovers. Right? Lover number one says, "You always leave a stack of dirty dishes in the sink and your socks on the floor." Lover number two, "You always leave stacks of dirty dishes and your socks on the floor. But I admit that I often leave the lights on and have probably wasted too much money. Which one is more credible?" Number one is only talking about liberal democracy and its flaws. And people who only hear that story are indeed going to doubt these values of liberalism itself, democracy, free speech, right? Lover number two hasn't abandoned that critique. Lover number two has the same critique, but from a point of view of, I'm to start from the perspective of the shortcomings in my own political home. So the critique doesn't change, the context changes. So again, I'm not offering this as the only or ultimate solution, but maybe one way in.
Right. So,
In other words, it's not just a technique for marriage counseling. It's a technique for the most burning controversies of our time.
mm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, no, that's fine. Sorry, I think that that is actually a really profound analogy, and I think we will do our best to actually try and implement that here in our approach with what we're doing. Um, Eric, I want to say a huge thank you for your time and just your insights here, and I would really encourage all of our viewers and listeners to look for Eric's book online. It is called, once again, Coming Clean, and the subtitle is The Rise of Critical Theory and the Future of the Left. Eric's also written other books, which I would really strongly urge people to go and find, in particularly on free speech, which I think many of our audience would be very interested in. Eric, we can also find any of your sort of latest news. You have a website, I believe.
Yes, I do. It's just my name, ERICHEINZE or ZE.com. So just my name, all lowercase.com, and you'll land on it.
Okay, we'll put that in on this clip so that people can look it up. And just once more, Eric, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this, and we look forward to hearing more of your work and getting it up to date in the future.
And thank you very much, Nick. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.